There is no reason for Ukraine to give up territory it has successfully defended from Russian attacks for 4 years. And the Russian argument that Ukraine should surrender that territory because Russia will inevitably win it over in battle is a stretcher. That's not quite credible. The Trump administration should have nothing to do with that. It would be a mistake to push Ukraine to give up territory. The fact is, no matter what arrangement the US brings to the Kremlin will demand more.
Under what circumstances Putin-Zelenskyy meeting can really occur? Why Americans avoid the second round of Abu Dhabi talks? And how the hunt for the Russian shadow fleet could end? All of these topics I am about to discuss with American diplomat and former head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination of Department of State, Daniel Fried. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Будь ласка.
I would like you to share your expectations about upcoming second round of Abu Dhabi talks. It had been expected trilateral meeting, but then we got to know that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are not going. What does this indicate?
Well, I don't know what it indicates. Whether it is the U.S. worst case lack of interest, which I don't believe, or whether Witkoff and Kushner, who are oversubscribed, they have too many responsibilities, are being grabbed by some other issue. I don't know, and I have heard mixed and differing reports about the talks. But there is at least some reason to believe that the talks are still progressing. One question I have is whether the Americans have in fact pushed the Ukrainians to give up territory to the Russians, the rest of Donbass, Donetsk Oblast. I think that would be a terrible idea. I hope it is not true. I have heard other reports that the Ukrainians are reasonably happy with the direction of the talks, including the security discussions. So there is much we don't know. The Trump administration is being pretty tight about the information it provides. That could be a good thing, but there is a wide range of possible outcomes. The fact is, the Americans are going to have to stare down the Russians at some point. Appealing to Russian or Putin goodwill is not going to work. The Russians are going to demand more. And at some point, the US will have to use the leverage that we have, the leverage available to push the Russians to negotiate in good faith. We can do this, but I am not certain that we will. So it is an open question.
I got you. After the first round, Ukrainian and American delegations said that new format is a step forward, but at the same time, they didn't say anything specific. Do you agree that this is a real step forward? I mean, this format. And whatever you respond, yes or no, explain why.
Well, I think it is interesting that the Russian negotiators seem to be more serious people. Kirill Dmitriev is not somebody who's going to land a deal. And I think the Russians, it is possible that the Russians are actually more flexible in private than they are in public. But I don't know that to be the case. And I have a certain reserve about the optimistic American briefings about the talks when it's US officials, because I think they have been sometimes too optimistic. and too willing to see progress where there is none. But I'm not dismissing the possibility of progress. And I will give credit to the Trump negotiators. They have moved this process forward, especially with the Europeans, about security for Russia, for Ukraine, and security guarantees against renewed Russian aggression. Yesterday, Secretary of State Rubio testified to Congress that the U.S. would, in fact, act as a backstop for the European forces who would be inside Ukraine. Now, a serious U.S. backstop means backing up the Europeans with military assets is a critical element of any security arrangements for Ukraine, and he said so in testimony, which means there is something real about this process. So that is progress, and I give credit to the Trump administration, but it is still contingent on a ceasefire, and Russia can withhold a ceasefire as long as it thinks that by doing so, it will prevent security for Ukraine from being implemented. So we're still stuck in this position where we require Russian permission, and we're going to have to get past this by pushing back on the Russians.
Do you know anything about U.S. delegation perception towards new head of Zelensky office, Kirilo Budanov? How Americans consider him?
I think probably he has less baggage than his predecessor. So I think he is apt to be well regarded by the Americans, but what the Americans who count in this context are, other than Trump, are Witkoff and Kushner. And I don't want to speak of their views because I'm simply not confident that I know them. But I will say that despite initial skepticism about both of them, they have been advancing this process. We're in better shape than we were on, let us say, on February 28th of last year. So that's something.
Yeah, and how would you describe current strategy of every participant of peace talks? And how would you assess chances of each participant to outplay the opponent?
The Ukrainian delegation and the Ukrainian government has handled the Trump administration in general, and these talks in particular, with considerable skill. They have positioned themselves as the party that says yes. And they have maneuvered Russia into the position where it is the party that says no. The fact is that enough progress was made between the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans on security that the Russians attempted to derail that with their ridiculous, ill-prepared accusations that Ukraine had sent drones to attack one of Putin's palaces. Even by Kremlin standards, this was a badly prepared and transparently non-credible accusation. It speaks to a degree of alarm, even panic on the Kremlin, that they felt they had to try this with great haste, which means the Ukrainians and Americans and Europeans had moved ahead. So I give credit to the Europeans. With respect to the Americans, I think that at least some Americans in the Trump administration have concluded that U.S. interests would be better served through a sustainable peace. Now, there has been a Trump administration instinct to push the Ukrainians to give more to the Russians under the illusion that if we show sufficient flexibility, Putin will negotiate in good faith. This is nonsense. Putin will negotiate only when he feels he has no choice. which leads us to the Russians. They do not want a deal. They want Ukraine's surrender. But if as the Soviets used to say, the correlation of forces shifts against them, the Russians are capable of negotiating, but they will not do so unless they're pressed. And the U.S. will need to use the leverage it has. And we do have leverage. We do have leverage. I've dealt with foreign policy problems where the United States lacked serious leverage. This is not one of them. We do have leverage. We should use it.
Could you specify what kind of leverage do you have, the main one?
Well, you mentioned earlier the shadow fleet. Russian economy is still dependent on income from oil exports. The United States seized a tanker originally associated with Venezuela that had reflagged itself as a Russian ship. The U.S. seized it with British help. Last week in Davos, French President Emmanuel Macron announced that France had seized another Russian tanker, Russian-flagged shadow fleet tanker. So the British, the French, and the Americans believe that under certain circumstances, there is legal authority to seize shadow fleet oil tankers with Russian-flagged vessels. I think 2 days ago, a number of Baltic and Nordic European nations issued a statement where they said that they believe they had the right to seize Russian shadow fleet tankers that are dual flagged, and that they would regard such vessels as effectively stateless, leaving them liable to seizure. If the Europeans and Americans agree that we can seize a number of Russian shadow fleet tankers, that to me looks like an opportunity. That to me looks like leverage. You tell the Russians, we are done with your nonsense at the negotiating table and your demands that Ukraine surrender territory that Russia has been unable to win through nearly 4 years of full-scale war. And unless Russia negotiates seriously, we are going to strip you of the ability to export oil. That looks like leverage to me.
I totally agree with you, but at the same time, I would like to understand to what extent this leverage is efficient, because we know that Russia has thousands of ships of this shadow fleet and many options to circumvent sanctions.
Oil is a physical commodity. It is easy to smuggle in high-end ships. A little harder to stop. Oil has to go by tankers or by pipelines. The pipelines are being shut down. The tankers are moving. They are big. They can be identified. They can be sanctioned. Some of them can be seized. So we need to start going after it. The Trump administration put full blocking sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. That has hurt Russian oil exports. Russia now has to export oil at a discount. That takes money out of Putin's war machine. That's good. It's not good enough. We can do more. And we should do more. We ought to go after Russia's shadow fleet, and not just by sanctioning it, by seizing it. That could damage Russia's export earnings at a time when its economy is already under pressure.
Europeans said to Trump's face that they are not going to put up with the new American approach to global security. I would like to hear your forecast how EU-USA relations could evolve further in terms of transatlantic cooperation.
Oh, you're asking a difficult question, because the U.S. has been burning up for no good reason a lot of transatlantic good political capital. Our threats, the U.S. threats against Greenland and Denmark, were costly. The brief threat of tariffs that Trump used against Europe for the sake of intimidation in order to support his claims against Greenland was costly. So this is a problem. The United States and Europe have had disagreements before, but Trump is eating away at some basic political capital, and this for no good reason. So this is doing the Kremlin's work for it. Now, this is not irreparable. Had the United States actually committed an act of aggression against Greenland and Denmark, that would have been irreparable. But where we are is not irreparable. But it is a problem. And the U.S. needs to get its priority, the Trump administration needs to get its priorities straight. It has argued that the United States has to deal with threats from Russia and China. If so, we should stop picking fights with Europe for no good reason. We do want Europe, we Americans do want Europe to step up more on providing for its own security and spending more on its military capabilities. This is perfectly reasonable demand from the Trump administration, and the Europeans have agreed. The Trump administration has won that argument. It needs to take yes for an answer and work with Europe rather than fighting Europe, especially on spurious cultural grounds. Such priorities are badly misplaced. The Trump administration sometimes has trouble distinguishing friends from adversaries. And it needs to pull itself together to deal with real world problems before more damage is done.
Yeah, but actually, you know that in my personal opinion, the biggest question right now in terms of EU-US relations, it's whether the fifth article of NATO work if Russia escalates in Europe.
Well, the signs are mixed. I will give the Trump administration credit for the way it was able to handle the NATO summit last year. Trump pushed European countries in NATO to increase defense spending. They agreed. And then the Trump administration wisely took the win. And the summit was positive, and Trump said good things about NATO. And he also said that the US would be there for NATO. Unfortunately, he coupled that with a criticism of NATO, saying that NATO countries had not been there for the United States, which is simply not true. NATO countries stepped up for the sake of the United States after the 9/11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And Trump criticized NATO countries for doing too little, and then basically had to walk back that criticism because a lot of NATO countries who had sent troops to Afghanistan and Iraq were furious, and rightly so. So the Trump administration takes a win, that is Europe's agreement to spend more on its military, and sacrifices it for no good reason. I think that the NATO alliance is still there and in decent shape, but Trump has put unnecessary stress on it, and that stress can be seen by the Kremlin as an opportunity. So, not a comfortable situation.
Yeah, I agree with you. Zelensky said that he's ready for a bilateral meeting with Putin to discuss Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and territorial issues. Putin has invited Zelensky to Moscow, as we know. I don't have any shred of doubt that any meeting like this has any sense. Why are they talking about it? Would they like to please Trump? And under what circumstances Putin-Zelensky meeting can really occur?
Well, a Russian invitation for Zelensky to come to Moscow will have little appeal in Bankova, and it shouldn't. There is a rich history of Russian and Soviet invitations to leaders for meetings from which those invited never return. I think that this Kremlin offer was, as they say, trolling. I don't think it was serious. I think its purpose might have been to convince some in the Trump administration that the Russians were interested in talks. But it is rather clumsy and transparent, even by Kremlin standards. I think, on the other hand, that President Zelenskyy and his people have handled the Americans and Trump administration rather skillfully, especially after the February 28th meeting in the Oval Office.
Yeah. International media reported that USA hint Ukraine that any American security guarantees are depend on our readiness to withdraw Ukrainian troops from all territory of Donbass. We have talked about it a little bit before. And if I have understood correctly, sequence of actions looks like first Ukraine withdraw troops, and then we will talk about implementation of security guarantees. What do you think about this kind of trajectory?
I wouldn't take it were I in the Ukrainians' place. There is no reason for Ukraine to give up territory it has successfully defended from Russian attacks for 4 years. And the Russian argument that Ukraine should surrender that territory because Russia will inevitably win it over in battle is a stretcher. That's not quite credible. The Trump administration should have nothing to do with that. It would be a mistake to push Ukraine to give up territory. The fact is, no matter what arrangement the US brings to the Kremlin will demand more. Sooner or later, at some point, the US is going to have to stare down the Russians. So we might as well do it on the basis of a good deal rather than for the sake of a bad deal, since stare them down is something we will have to do in any event. And the Ukrainians will make up their own mind. And it's not for me to tell them where their interests lie. It's not for any American to do that. I think the Ukrainians are right to resist these US demands, if they are US demands. I'm not convinced that they are. And remember, the Trump administration sometimes pushes, but when it meets resistance, it changes course. The fact is, the Russians are the obstacle to this deal, not the Ukrainians. And the Russian demands that Ukraine retreat and abandon its fortified zone in the Donbass is a foolish one. Now, I do remember that the Ukrainians a few weeks ago were talking about a mutual withdrawal and establishment of a demilitarized zone. Now, that's interesting. For one thing, the Ukrainians weren't saying no to the Americans. And for another thing, a mutual withdrawal might be able to work if the demilitarized zone were monitored, and according to one of the plans for security, the Americans would be responsible for the demilitarized zone or the ceasefire zone security monitoring. That's interesting. I'm not saying it would definitely work, but it is interesting to explore. It also suggests that the Ukrainians are negotiating in a smart fashion. That is, not saying no, but coming up with ideas. But as I said, the US is going to have to use its leverage to push Russia at some point. We might as well do it for the sake of a reasonable deal rather than a bad deal.
Yeah, but actually, as we know, I'm totally convinced that Russia will reject this idea. I mean, when both sides withdraw their troops.
Well, look, probably, huh? But Russian demands should not be taken at face value. The Russians will demand everything up until the moment where they realize that they will gain nothing by doing so. The Russians do know how to negotiate. They just prefer not to unless they have no other choice. So let's give them no other choice. Let's use our leverage. Let's back up Ukraine, eliminate restrictions on their use of weapons, increase the pressure on Russia, and make it clear that Russia will not be able to manipulate us anymore. I'm not saying that'll work. I'm saying that the odds of that it will work are better than simply giving things to the Russians in hopes that our goodwill will entice them to reciprocate. It won't.
I would like to expand a little bit our discussion about security guarantees. As we know, Zelensky said that security guarantees haven't already been agreed by USA and Ukraine, but we still don't know, but we still don't understand how they look like. We have heard a lot about analog of the fifth article of NATO and European troops deployment in Ukraine after the end of the war. How do you understand logic of security guarantees implementation, and what Russian role in this process?
Well, I haven't seen the details. There is one big problem right up front with the framework for the security arrangements for Ukraine, is that it is still contingent on a ceasefire agreement, and that gives Russia an effective veto. Russia says it will never allow troops from NATO countries to enter Ukraine. That means, presumably, that the Russians will refuse a ceasefire until security for Ukraine no longer includes Western forces inside the country. I don't think we ought to wait for Russia's permission. I think that there is an argument to be made that European countries should tell Russia, either you negotiate a ceasefire and an end to the war, or we're going to provide security for Ukraine without your damn permission. The Russians will threaten to attack Western troops. At some point, we will have to push back against the Russians. Now, this can be gradually. I can imagine air patrols over Western Ukraine. I can imagine sending in air defense units into Ukraine and not necessarily advertising it. But I think that greater pressure on Russia can break this logjam. And I think we need to do so. So the first problem is that the Russians have under the current negotiating structure, the Russians have a veto. A second problem are the details. What does the US backstop for the European forces mean? I'm glad that Secretary Rubio said this yesterday in a formal public statement to Congress. But does that mean US air power? Does that mean US intelligence? I'd like to see more. Now, this is the security arrangements, as I understand them, are not like Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. They're not it, they're not like it, but they're much more than anything Ukraine has gotten in the past. Ukraine got basically nothing in the Budapest Memorandum except the paper. You got nothing during the Minsk Accords. It may have something now, and this may be serious. If you listen to what Secretary Rubio said, he acknowledged that the US backstop was serious. So I give credit to the Trump administration for going much farther than the Biden administration ever did. This is a pretty big deal. And I will give Trump credit for it if he lands the deal. He has not done so yet, but he could, at which point a ceasefire in place plus security for Ukraine could end this conflict on terms that would leave unoccupied Ukraine, 82% of the country, in relatively decent shape, ready to rebuild. This would be a big victory. It would leave Ukraine better off than Finland was after the Winter War. I'm not saying we will get there. I'm saying we could. This would be a significant achievement. It would be good for Ukrainian security, good for European security, good for the United States. To get there, the US and Europe will have to stare down Putin.
Yeah, but actually at the same time, we see that in current period of time, Putin is not ready for any concessions, and he is not ready to surrender. And actually, my last question is, how do you assess Russian political, military, and economic capabilities to continue a war of attrition? And what factors should we pay attention to in current period of war in this context? I mean, what is Russia's strongest and weakest right now?
Well, your two questions are related. Russia does not want to negotiate now. And from Putin's point of view, that is a rational choice. That is, he can calculate that either Europe will cave or the United States will cave. If he is convinced otherwise, he may change his calculation. Right now, he has every incentive to maintain his maximalist position. Especially, well, he will do so as long as it has a reasonable chance of bringing results. We need to disabuse him. We need to show him that his maximalism will bring very bad results, which means we have to increase the pressure on Putin. If we do, there is a chance he will change his calculation. The Russians know how not to negotiate, but they also know how to negotiate when they have to. And our job is to push the Russians. Now, how is their economy? What is the social situation? What are their vulnerable points? Their economy is under stress. That's pretty clear. It seems to me that Putin is nervous about a general mobilization in Russia, especially mobilizing the young men in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He doesn't want to do so. Russian casualties are high. I don't believe the Russian conduct of the war is indefinitely sustainable. I think Putin is throwing everything he can on the battlefield right now, hoping to convince Trump that Russian victory is inevitable and hoping to convince Trump to push the Ukrainians to give up all the Donbass. If Trump resists and the Ukrainians continue to resist successfully on the battlefield, and if the US and Europe use the leverage at our disposal, that could change the calculation. I hope we do.
Yeah, but at the same time, in what scope of activity Russia right now has strong position, if it does?
Well, there's always the chance that Russia will have an unexpected success on the battlefield. I don't think that's going to happen, but I can't rule it out entirely. I think that Russia's economy is not on the verge of collapse, but it is on the verge of stress. Mm-hmm. The fact is, we don't know the pressure points inside Russia. There is some evidence from a survey of Russian online commentary, there's growing frustration with Russia's evident failures on the battlefield. So I think the stresses are there. We know about the stresses in Ukraine. The stresses in Russia tend to be hidden and tend to emerge suddenly. I'm not saying Russia's on the verge of collapse. I'm saying that they are not impervious to pressure. There is a notion, a kind of myth in the West, that Russia has an infinite capacity for suffering, and the evidence of that is really World War II and Lev Tolstoy's version of the war of the Napoleon campaign in 1812. But Russia has lost plenty of wars. It lost the Crimean War. It lost the Russo-Japanese War. It lost World War I to the Germans. And it lost the Afghanistan War. And after each of those losses, there was either domestic reform or domestic turmoil or both.
Daniel, thank you very much for this interview. I really appreciate your expertise, and I know that you understand Ukrainian. That's why I would like to say you in Ukrainian. Дуже вам дякую і до побачення.
Будь ласка, до побачення. І слава Україні!
Героям слава!